All right, we will commence with our next session. We will be proceeding with our keynote speaker, Tero Mustonen. So Tero, he is a Finnish environmental leader, scholar, scientist, and fisherman. He is the head of a village of Selki. He is head of the village of Selki, Finland, and the founder and president of the Snow Change Cooperative, an organization made of indigenous and local communities that is focused on conserving local culture, biodiversity, and ecosystems. For his efforts to restore damaged peatlands with the Snow Change Cooperative, Tero was awarded the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2023. Mustonen completed a doctoral degree with the University of Eastern Finland in 2009. He remained at the university for several years, working as a part-time researcher and teacher. So please, Tero, thank you.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you for that introduction. Of course, at the very start, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of Nipaluna and Lutruvita and Janice, your kind words, and the folks from here, the indigenous hosts, and all the traditional territories and ancestors that are hosting us today. Those of you who have zero interest in mammals or traditional knowledge, you can go to sleep now or get some coffee. So I can inform you when you can come back at let's say 9:45 or something. But the jokes aside, yeah, I'm a Finnish person from a small community and currently leading the unit called Snow Change, and I'm very happy to, of course, see many of the friends and colleagues over the past years here, and thank you for inviting me to this important event. I was told the next keynote has cancelled, so does that imply I have 100 minutes and then So I thought I'll explain about this fellow for a while, and then we can have a chat if you have any questions about more broadly about the different ways of knowing or engagement with knowledge systems and data, as you call it or we call it, and we can have a yarn about that. Before I do that, I'll just add that, of course, I'm especially thankful to Julia Collins, who created this link to come to speak with you. I have traveled here actually on a multiple purpose mission because we have had some collaboration with the indigenous folks from Australia for over 20 years, both up in Cairns area with fire sticks and restoration of country through indigenous knowledge, and down here, for example, with future seas and the understanding of how should we be looking at the Australia from science and indigenous viewpoints. So it's not the first trip, but it's great to be back, and it always feels like summer here. So thank you for enabling to come back to summer when it's just winter back home. Today, I thought that I'll travel with him, the Eurasian red squirrel, Sciurus vulgaris, as he's known in Latin. Now, those of you who don't know Finland, you may associate our place with the Santa Claus and the reindeer, and I have some very bad news for you that we actually eat Rudolph the reindeer, but it's actually the red squirrel. That's one of the most significant cultural animals of our parts, and it's also the only day active mammal we have. So today I want to highlight some of the points before linking this with the Polar Data Forum on why would this fellow matter in your large AI-driven oceanic data sets or something else. The mammal itself is quite small. Our squirrel is roughly 20 to 24 centimeters and weighs usually 200 to 400 grams. And you can say that red squirrel is one of the most iconic symbols of the boreal subarctic forests. And when people talk about forests or think about them, they usually are really concerned about the tropical rainforests like Amazonia, but people don't really always think about the fact that it's actually the boreal forests, Scots pine and spruce forests that start in the Pacific and stretch across Siberia into Finland and then hop over to Canada and Alaska, that are the largest ecosystem on the planet beside the oceans. And that's why sometimes when we think of our forests, we call them the Amazonia of the North, I mean the primary forests, because of their significance as carbon sinks, maintenance of this vast boreal belt of trees and landscapes that stretches the whole northern part of the planet. And equally so here in Tasmania, of course, you have very unique and important forests as well. So red squirrel is really a symbol for that taiga or boreal forest, and why would I talk about that here? It has to do with 10th of July 2024, roughly a year ago. There was a murder that I want to report. There was murder. This is coming from a drive that I was having towards the Snow Change HQ on a small community called Kiihtelysvaara. It's on the way from my house to our organizational headquarters. And as I drove to the organization's headquarters daily, every morning, on the right-hand side of the road was always young dead squirrels almost every day. And of course, or they were always new animals. So almost every night, every day, they were slaughtered by the traffic. And I was thinking, how did we get here? Yeah, so as I was driving and so on, every morning there was more and more dead young squirrels on the side of the street. And I was thinking, this happens in Kiihtelysvaara, with the place name indicating a very strong red squirrel community and habitat. And there we are, we kill them by large numbers daily on the side of the road without any care or connection or significance anymore. And that led me to write a science paper on a kind of an exploration or journey on the significance, status, and trends of the red squirrel that we have in Finland. And today I want to touch on a number of indicators or points on that journey. You can find the open access paper, of course, if you just Google it. But it was a remarkable journey because I started to discover that nobody actually knows how the squirrel is doing in Finland. Very few science papers have taken place. And secondly, we don't have abundance of data on baselines of this animal. We do know across Europe and some other parts, for example in North America, that there's a big divide given the fact that many squirrels and other mammals are moving into cities because of food and food webs. But we don't have a lot of knowledge on the, for example, status of how things have been and how they are in the rural areas and in the forests. And that was a big surprise to me. So witnessing and observing these dead squirrels on the side of the road, and then on the other hand, realizing that we don't even know how this most relevant daytime mammal in Finland is doing, led me to wonder why this might be the case. And that's why I started to engage with our knowledge holders. There's a fellow called Väinö Viitapohja, born 1936. He's one of the last surviving professional squirrel hunters. And this is an activity he was doing when he was a young adult after the Second World War. And I started to work with this oral historian. There was 2 other fellows as well, to try to discover how things used to be and where are we today. And I was trying to divide it into two parts. The other one was, what do we know and how should we approach the red squirrel from the cultural viewpoint of forest Finnish or Finnish older society? And secondly, going back to the ecology, how should we be trying to know more about the status and trends? And when I started to work with Väinö and his oral histories, I also embarked on a journey to look at our archives and the linguistic materials of Finnish peoples. You know that our language is connected with the Sami indigenous peoples and many other Finno-Ugric languages of that part of Europe. So when you hear Finland or think about the Santa Claus or the Rudolph the reindeer, they are actually post-Ice Age cultural landscapes where our oral histories, songs, and the language, just like here we heard from Janice, goes back thousands of years in that boreal forest and peatland ecosystems. So one of the very early things I was trying to do was to try to find out what concepts do we have regarding the squirrel. What does the language, the Finnish language, still say about the animal? And what are some of the more deep and oldest versions of relations we might have, given the fact that we today kill them daily in traffic and don't really care about the dead bodies on the side of the road. And one of the things I discovered was that this word kiihtelys, and then of course some of you may know that kiihtelys is for tikkuri. How many of you knew that? Well, not many of course, but kiihtelys implies 40 squirrel skins, and tikkuri implies 10 squirrel skins. So for the old folks, the squirrel was a way of endemic counting. That's how we counted value. And in fact, even today, when you hear money, the word money in Finnish language, it's called raha. And if you translate raha, it translates as the squirrel skin. So one of the ways the animal was centrally placed in the forest economy or forest society was that we had our own way of counting. 40 squirrel skins, 10, or when you have 4 tikkuri, that implies a certain concept that's only known in the language. Or if we thought of spatial organization or ordering of the boreal forest, there's a concept called oravimetsä. Many of you may look at the wonderful wilderness photos from Finland with, let's say, the boreal forest or taiga, but it's actually divided into sections based on the cultural uses of the land use and occupancy. And this word oravimetsä is a kind of a spatial concept of good areas for squirrel or actually owned by the squirrel. So the squirrel would be the traditional owner of that part of his forest. And the last profound discovery I made in the archival work was that the name we have for squirrel, orava, is a very prominent Finnish last name. And when I looked at some of the stuff from that side, there was a link between totemic relation of squirrels and certain families in the old religion. You know that Finnish people used to have our own religion before we were the last place in Europe together with the Sami to be switching to Christianity. And in that older way of knowing and forest religion, what survives is the last names of many families that are linked with squirrels. And there are scholars that have made the case for a totemic connection that would be very comparable with the indigenous Australian view of country and relations across species. And on some details in the culture, we had whistling arrows. So Finland used to be one of the last places of use of bow. For the Sami indigenous peoples, they would call it juoksa, and we call it varsiousi. And all the way to well into historic era, we are discussing 1600s, even 1700s in my community, we would still use bow and arrow as opposed to rifles for some of the hunting. So it's only a few hundred years ago that we were maintaining some of the cultural practices in hunt that were very old. And inside that package of hunting society and how we were harvesting different animals, we had whistling arrows designed for the squirrel. And the idea was that when we shoot with the bow or crossbow, the arrow will make a whistling sound. And this sound will surprise the squirrel. What is this sound? And he will stay put, and then we get his gift of both the fur and the meat. So there are still people who have used both the skin for selling or their economy, and then the meat was eaten, especially in our parts in eastern Finland, especially in the times of scarcity and all the way to 1970s. And Väinö Viitapohja, this oral historian that I'll talk about next, was one of the people who observed that, let's say, holistic use of the animal, and all parts were used. There could be many more examples, but I promised you only a 100-minute lecture, so I'll skip those, and you can ask about the culture if you want. But the other part that's very prominent or related to the Polar Data Forum and the topical issues we are discussing, including all of the stuff from AI and how do we know, and Peter will talk about what matters in the afternoon and so on, is linked with something that I was then trying to push over the past year when I was writing the article on the squirrel regarding how could we be understanding the past and the present of what's going on in the ecological side, status and trends of the animal. So, of course, the first discovery was this wealth of cultural materials, the linguistic connections, perhaps a potential totemic relation in the old society and religion, and then very sophisticated and dedicated tools and examples of arrows, like the whistling arrow, to harvest the animal. All going on to say that the gap, perhaps the gap with the murder every day on the road to Kiihtelysvaara, where the young squirrels are there, killed by the road kills, and then how we used to think about the animal was profound. And then coming to this scientific understanding, I found out that there's only a handful of scientific papers to discuss the population or how it's doing. Let's give you the headline right away. So many of the few studies that have been done on red squirrel in Finland indicate downward shift, a trend, and a link to do with these urban habitats where many of the animals are moving into cities just like people. And given I'll give you another wonderful statistic. So in Finland, when you think of the reindeer forests and Santa Claus, here's a dark fact that 95% of our timber forests have been gone. They are second growth and economic forests. Let's stop there for a second. It's just like here. 95% of our primary habitat has been altered and wrecked by industrial society. And of course, this has had huge implications for keystone species like the squirrel that are very important in predator-prey relations or seed dispersal in the boreal forests. But the scale of loss of primary forests and taiga forest in Finland is so profound that we don't even know what has been lost and what are the scales of loss, let alone trying to think about how to preserve the last bits. Of course, we have protected areas, but just you are data scientists and you know from your data sets that when you have 95% loss on anything, whether it's the giant kelps here in Tasmania and Australia or some other species, that's profound. That's a system shift. That's a collapse and much to do with what we heard this morning about how do we navigate and coordinate with good data sets. So I discovered that there is no data set, especially on the historical side. And therefore, I started to work with Väinö Viitapohja's Oral Histories. He's now 93, and when I was phoning him to let him know that I'll be speaking about his knowledges and oral history in Australia, he said, he's 93 now, so he said that, oh, that's wonderful, please convey my best to the conference. Please tell them that unfortunately I won't be going on any hunting trips anymore. I'm a bit on the old side, but nevertheless, thank you for paying attention to my oral histories. So, of course, there would be dozens of indicators and ways Väinö, as a squirrel hunter, was looking at these boreal forests and the animals from 1940s to onwards, but I'll just give you some of the highlights to illustrate, then coming to the conclusion of my keynote on why does this matter on the data file. So one of the things we try to do in snow change, and this is relevant especially in the Arctic. We can go to the Antarctic file in a second, but one of the characteristics of the boreal and the subarctic and the Arctic is that we could ask a meta-level question: how do we know about the past in this region? And of course, the simple answer in science is that either you have had expeditions, perhaps different diaries by ocean-going vessels and expeditions, and moving on to present day, you may still have expeditions out there, ice core samples, and so on, combined with modeling and remote sensing. But this will still leave huge amounts of the area unknown for the past. And that's why in the paper and with the squirrel, I was working on something called backcasting. Backcasting is a mechanism, or perhaps you can call it a method, if you have the consented view and the knowledge holders, to try to understand a very simple question: what happened? What were the events of significance from the past in those areas where we don't have a lot of knowledge? And one of the only sources of information regarding the past is and are the cultural artifacts, knowledges, and presence on the land by local folks and indigenous peoples. Backcasting implies that we are trying to look how things used to be based on the available collaborations to reconstruct a trend or reconstruct a mission to try to understand, for example, abundance. And one of the things we learned with Väinö, this oral historian that's in the paper, was that he was carefully pointing out the link between cone production of spruce trees and pine trees, and then the abundance of the squirrels. And he also gave us the territorial or spatial scale of how and where he was hunting. It was roughly 10,000 hectares of boreal forests, and then he was sharing his hunting statistics for the animals he was gathering. These were roughly 600 animals a year in 1940s and 50s, which gave us a fantastic baseline for the very first time from his region. This would imply that one squirrel, on a statistical terms, was using roughly 16.6 hectares of boreal forest when he was able to harvest. Again, we could pause there, 600 animals for living. That's a quite distinct number, and points also to quite healthy stocks. We do know that squirrel stocks go up and down based on the cone production, but nevertheless, it also speaks volumes of the healthy and intact boreal forests that could sustain harvest of 600 animals over 10,000 hectare hunting territory. And if we then look at this number, 16.6 hectares, and look at what science talks about today, how big territories are the boreal squirrels using, it comes roughly in scale. So we have some in Finland and Sweden we have territories that the animals use, which are usually in the range of 20 to 25 hectares. So it comes close enough to make the case that Weiner's observations and knowledge of how baseline populations used to be in 1940s and 50s might make sense. The other very important thing that's related to polar data or this kind of work that all of you are doing has to do with even longer past. And one of the characteristics of the animal, the squirrel, are these very large migrations that they may take, with the last one being 1943, that Weiner implied in his oral histories. That's the very last time the squirrels have traveled in millions over dozens, sometimes hundreds of kilometers in search of food or other means. And by looking at the archives, we discovered that such migrations took place in 1671, 1751, and onwards to the early parts of 1900s, with, as said, the last one being 1943. We also learned that in North America, there could have been squirrel migrations that, and here comes a number for all of you data fans, there could be migrations of 450 million animals all at once across North American temperate forests. And these migrations were so vast, perhaps 150 to 100 years ago, that as they were proceeding on the temperate forests in North America, the squirrels, or the migration, how do you call it, like a flock or a herd of squirrels, was over 20 miles deep. Hundreds of millions of animals on the move. And that's profound. That talks about abundance. And when we worked with this oral historian, Weiner, and some of the archival materials, we started to understand scale, historic significance, and profound loss. If the large migration of the squirrels in Finland was in 1943, and not a single one since, that's a message in itself. That the cycles and the ways the animals are behaving are at loss. They are being impacted by all sorts of things, including boreal forestry and climate and so on. Those of you who are familiar with the work from Alaska and North American Arctic may be very, shall we say, or you may know well the work of Ernst Birch. Birch was very respected scholar that looked at backcasting of the number of caribou, especially the northwest herd of Alaska on the Seward Peninsula and surrounding Inupiaq areas. And one of the most profound ecosystem studies that Birch was doing in Alaska, much like we tried to investigate for the squirrel back home, was the abundance and trend and number of subherds or different herds of caribou in Western Alaska between 1850 and 2000. Okay, let's again stop on that number, 1850. That's a number for Alaska. How many of you have worked in Alaska or use Alaska data? A few, yeah, I know Peter at least. So all of you then will know that there was no science missions out to Western Alaska in abundance in 1850, at least for staying for the whole year or counting how many caribou are out there. The only sources of information we might have in 1850 are from Russian expedition diaries or explorers or the whalers or people, traders providing first rifles to the Inupiaq or so on and so on. And what Birch was doing was roughly the same kind of a study where he worked with a number of, in 1960s and 70s, with a number of very ancient and knowledgeable Inupiaq elders to try to find out why did the caribou crash in the latter part of the 1800s in Western Alaska, and secondly, how many herds were there. So again, not to go into the actual study, but to point out that when later on Igor Krupnik and some of the other colleagues have been studying Birch's work on caribou, including DNA studies, they have started to understand that actually the Inupiaq elders, no doubt, and why wouldn't they be right, were correct in their messages and oral history given to birds on multiple herds and some of the new discoveries on the reason of the collapse of the caribou in Western Alaska. That was explained for decades by science using overhunting and proliferation of weapons, rifles to the Inupiaq. And then suddenly birds came up with a number of other reasons that started to make the picture much more complex. And that's in a way the central message that Väinö and the squirrel and myself wanted to give you today, that when we study the Arctic and the Antarctic and the boreal, which is kind of linked subarctic, it's much more complex, it's much more varied, and there's so much more going on than what you think is going on. I promised something on the Antarctic file, and I'll just say that a colleague from New Zealand, Aotearoa, Professor Sandy Morrison, about 10 years ago published some of the early findings of how the Maori went to Antarctic waters hundreds of years before the European voyaging vessels. How do we know that? Is based on the Maori oral history and the songs when they left the South Island to go further into the Roaring Forties and beyond. And in the Maori oral histories that are kept with the iwi and the tribal groups, they have oral history of discussing how the world, as they went further and further and further with their waka or the Maori canoes, they came to an area where the world turned huka. Huka is a Maori word for snow and ice, or white world. And then they also left some of the small island outposts with some Maori oral history and navigational waypoints. So again, we thought for hundreds of years that the Antarctic waters are to be discovered, and this week there is an important Antarctic conference here as well as our forum. But lo and behold, the Maori were there hundreds of years before the Europeans, and only by working with the trusted knowledge holders like Sandy did and the oral historians, we started to gather this new discovery of far more complex journeys into the Antarctic waters than previously thought. What does all of this matter? Why are we talking about the squirrel in Hobart? Because the closest squirrel is probably 10,000 kilometers away and dying on the side of the road or something. Finns are pessimistic and dark, so it's. But anyways, I wanted to conclude with two ways snow change is trying to respond to action, because that's. I think Peter once asked me 10 years ago that what is the role of an Arctic NGO or something like that in Tokyo, and I was trying to answer to him that folks like snow change and the NGO world is always a little bit different than large universities or research institutes, even if we do a lot of research and data gathering in snow change. So NGOs should always be on the vanguard of reform and action. That's why they exist. If you are not doing that as an NGO, you shouldn't be an NGO. You should be in a university. So one of the things we have done over the past 5 years is something called event databases, much in line of what you have been sleeping to this morning with Väinö's oral history and the squirrels, funnily, or jokes aside. You can find these indigenous and local knowledge databases in a website called arcticseas.org. I can also, of course, share that with you later. These are coming from a 5-year mission of a large European Union-funded project called the Arctic Passion. Chantal and Jean-René and many of us went to the final conference in Potsdam just a few weeks ago. It was a 5-year mission to try to, and spending huge amount of money. We could have saved all the squirrels in Finland with that money, but nevertheless, over 15 million euros. But a large chunk of that was trying to engage for the meaningful way with the indigenous folks in the Arctic to try to report exactly what Väinö from the Finnish side was explaining in the paper, what happened, what are the events of significance that took place in some cases over the past 100, 200 years, all the way to myth time, as Janice was talking about the ancestors here and the knowledges that you have preserved here for thousands of years. In fact, indigenous Australians know they have the longest memory of all of the humankind. So they should be prominently placed to inform us what's sustainable life and relations with the planet. But in any case, there's now 9 indigenous databases across the Arctic, publicly available, all consented by the knowledge holders that are available, and please go and check them at arcticseas.org. When I go and try to speak in many events, and people always say that, okay, we are scientists and everybody stresses the importance of indigenous knowledge, but where is it? How could we try to look into that? Therefore, we created over the past 5 years these databases of significance, consented, free and informed consent, to make them available so that people could enjoy and understand the Arctic better. But that's not enough. The squirrels are still dead on the side of the road in Kiihtelyvaara every morning. And we are still at loss. We still have the numbers, we still have the scale. 95% of the boreal forests are gone in Finland. And that's why Snow Change launched about 10 years ago, after 15 years of trying to inform the decision makers about the importance of all sorts of drivers of change in the North, landscape rewilding program that's now covering 171 sites, including indigenous Sami forests, out of harm's way. And we have grown to be the largest land program in Finland to secure the critically important boreal forests, both for the squirrel and for us who try to still maintain a life in the boreal forests. Thank you for your time. And I just want to acknowledge the forum. So I brought a small gift from our side. It's a Sami. I'm not a Sami, I'm a Finn, but this is a Sami collaboration with the Canadian Gwich'in indigenous peoples. And it's coming off, I'll just say a sentence. So it's a book of photographs that span from 1960s to 80s. And these 2 communities were part of that large 5-year mission to share oral histories of the past. And when we were bringing knowledge back home and thanking them, what would be a meaningful thing for the villages to enjoy, they said, can you enable these old photographs to be available for the folks? And that's why you'll be able to have a photographic journey into both Sami and Gwich'in life as it happened in 1960s in the Arctic. So thank you very much for having me.
We also want to present you with a book on Sciurus as well. So thank you very much.
Wow, this is Sciurus perspective. I like
that.
Do we have time for questions, or?
I think we do have a little bit of time for questions if anybody would like to ask some. So I'll leave it to the audience and to engage with Tero. Please.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yep, go ahead.
How much of the boreal forests are protected now in Finland? Like you said, you lost 95% of them in the original form.
The number of protected areas in Finland is mostly concentrated in the Arctic parts, which are also the least productive timber forests. So it's very easy to protect them because there's not that kind of a interest of economy there. And the large parks and the protected areas span perhaps, well, of course, this can be a matter of debate, but perhaps 10% of the old growth up there. And then once you travel closer to Helsinki, it gets much worse. So the protected areas are very, very small, perhaps only a few hectares, surrounded by that 95 to 98% of loss. And that has, of course, been the main driver of biodiversity loss, not just for the squirrel, but the squirrel has a cousin. I don't know if you have it here, but it's a flying squirrel, or rather a gliding squirrel. And but that's a story animal, and I don't want to talk about that. But that's another big indicator for the loss. But it's perhaps, depending on how strict IUCN protection you talk about, it's around 10-12% of the forests that are protected. Oh yeah, please go ahead.
The mass migration that you were talking about that is stopped. How do you know that it's, like, obviously it's a bad thing, but like how do you know it's a bad thing? Because like if they haven't run out of their food, like are they migrating? They usually migrate because they've run out of food source and they're migrating to find a new one. Like what makes that, the lack of that happening, an indicator as a bad thing?
Yes, that's a valid question. Thank you. And if I was a politician, I could say the next question, please.
Yeah, sorry.
But
migrating, they run out of food. That if they
that's a very good question. And going deeper into the migration question, what are the hard facts that I, of course, didn't have a lot of time to explain? Is that, well, first of all, they stopped. So we know that they used to be on a cycle. There's no clear pattern of every 10 years, but they did happen. The earliest one we know from Finland is that 1600s migration, and the last one being 1943. And then we have some comparative data or views from Siberia on the Russian side, because that's, of course, Siberia is further east, but it's the same kind of an ecosystem. And you have very large migrations in Kamchatka and eastern part of Siberia well into 1900s. Therefore, when you think of the reasons why and whether it's a negative driver, it's connected with squirrel behavior that has elements that are still, even to science, hard to explain. One of them has to do with this simultaneous behavior linked with cone production, not just in, let's say, 50 kilometers or 20 miles radius, but hundreds of kilometers apart. Large squirrel populations and individuals are responding to cycles of spruce and pine cone distribution and abundance, even today. That's not a migration, it's just a, let's say, a system-wide response. And the other hard fact, we know that the last migration does coincide with the large-scale loss or beginning of the large-scale loss of boreal forests in Finland, mainly on landscape level. So for any forests that you study, forest ecology, of course you can take the stand level, then you can take the, let's say, the landscape level, and then you can take the national level. And even if boreal forests are driven and are centrally as ecosystems, they need disturbances, fire, storms, large amounts of decaying timber, and then you have the climate factor that, of course, drives mortality of squirrels. One of the key facts is that, for the lack of better term, forest, if it's left alone, will function on its own. And that's one of our hypotheses for the squirrel stuff on why the migration stopped, that the forests in Finland no longer function as boreal forests. They are managed, heavily clear-cut. There are very open, large, very open, even to the extent in 1950s we had 20,000 hectare clear-cuts. Of course, not today anymore, but there were some experiments to clear-cut areas of kilometers wide open boreal forest spots. So timber forests are to Finland what oil is to Norway, kind of a national interest. And therefore, trying to explain why the migrations are no longer there or what drives them, of course, maybe when we gather here in 10 years or 5 years and you'll get the season 2 of the red squirrel, I have more on that, but it's, even to science, it's still not clearly known. It's of course partly driven by scarcity, and as we do know that squirrel populations peak and there's a big loss, even on a so-called natural cycle, when you have especially a large amount of females and overabundance, that triggers some smaller, let's say, migrations in scales that are not these large mass migrations. And you could theorize that if that happened all at once across the whole landscape level and national level, that might be a trigger event for the big migrations. But there are very many unknown facts, including the fact that they use waterways. There are oral history accounts that Väinö was sharing of how the squirrels can cross these very large open lake bodies, and of course some of them drown, but nevertheless one of the ways to observe these migrations was that they decide to swim across large Finnish lakes to a certain direction for hundreds of kilometers, and not all behavior was about food. So maybe this rambling answer can come to a close by saying that when I personally think about everything that I discovered in the past year about the squirrel, of course I knew something before, but never looked at the whole cultural complex and as well the available science. So the animal portrays tremendous amount of intelligence, cunning, and there are many unknowns. Maybe it's fitting to share a story that I didn't really want to share, because you are and we are all scientists, so you can now click on your skeptical science hat and dismiss the following. But when I was concluding the paper earlier this year, I live in the forest in a small house in the bush, and with my wife and 4 goats, and there was a young squirrel that came into the main room for the very first time when I had just wrapped up the manuscript, and he stayed for 3 days. That's also in the article. I was able to squeeze it through the peer review somehow, but the article concludes with the same story, so I can share it here as well. And we have been living in that house from 1800s for 20 years, and never before we have had a squirrel inside the main room. And that was very significant in the cultural core. So there's a lot of oral histories about when squirrel comes or becomes a messenger for the old folks. But this visit by this young male was not in any way a negative feeling, and it coincided with the ending of the manuscript for the piece. And then I went to him. He was kind of living on the rafters and behind the oven. And of course, my wife wasn't very happy when every morning he was running on the rafters and there was some dust that came down to the floor. But then on the second day, I went to him and I explained the manuscript to the squirrel. And I said that, thank you for coming, and these are the main facts that I found out. And the reason why I'm doing is that all of your brothers are lying dead there by the road in Kiitosvaara, and we kill them every morning because of the traffic. And the paper is really how we forgot about you and the end of our relationship with you, and how we destroyed this coexistence with you. He was very silent. Listened, as you can see. Well, we don't have the photo now, but these pointy, magnificent ears. And then the next morning he left. And again, being the skeptic scientist, you can dismiss everything like this. But for us who try to maintain or renew the cultural side, this is of course of high significance. And one of the ways we were able to observe that was that the paper went sailing past all the peer review, and it's not in Nature or Science, but it's a kind of mid-level journal, and fits well. And therefore, I'm happy to conclude that I worked with the squirrels to be here in Hobart. And what's the takeaway message at the end of everything is to say that, one, there's so much more to the story than data. Never forget that, even in the age of AI and all the wonderful things Peter discovered last week in that forum. And secondly, there are relationships and collaborations, like Janice was saying, that are still true, and they are real. They are not imagined. They are here, but most of us just forgot about them. Thank you for your interest.